At first, I thought there was an arbitrariness about my selection of pictures. I have not been in the National Gallery very much in the last few years. I have not been in England very much, and I must confess, this choice, if I tell you how it was made, would at first seem arbitrary. When I was first asked to select, the point was that the artist puts in a picture of his own, to suggest that the pictures of the past somehow relate to him. Well, I had made a picture of a friend of mine, Henry Geldzahler, looking at some other pictures. It was about the pleasure of looking, and the pictures he was looking at were reproductions I had purchased at the National Gallery. True, because I like them. But if all the pictures in the National Gallery were reproduced rather big, I might have chosen others. I made a selection from what was there and chose 4 pictures that gave me enormous pleasure. I then pinned them up on a wall at home. They had been many places. I had even moved about with them a bit. They were pinned on a screen eventually, and I painted a picture of Henry, who loves pictures, looking at them. I called the painting "Looking at Pictures on a Screen," because I thought the title would make you realize in another way from the picture that you could identify with him and his pleasure, because you were doing exactly the same, looking at it. Now, of course, if you don't like the picture, then you're not getting pleasure. But if there's something you can like about it, you're forced to identify with him in some way, in a very simple way. So I decided, well, these pictures were all from the National Gallery. Why not put in this picture of mine, which has all the other paintings in them, smaller? And then here were the real ones, the real objects that were the source of the pleasure. So we put them up in the room with the screen, with the reproductions and with my painting. Then I thought, what would that signify? What would you get from it? And then I thought, well, one thing that can come across quite clearly is if a painting is really wonderful, even in a reproduction form, even a cheap reproduction form, it can still give off a lot of its magic. You can't quite define what it is. Magic is a good term, it seems to me. And I have even noticed this magic sometimes in postcards of paintings. I was once in Albi at the Toulouse-Lautrec Museum, where they have a small painting of Voyart, of Lautrec. And they have a very beautiful postcard. I think the postcard is stunning. I saw it and I thought, my God, postcard is even giving off real vibrations, like the painting of the sheer delight. I thought the painting was delightful. It was unbelievably simple and fresh. Voyart must have just looked and watched Lautrec, probably almost out of the corner of his eye, and sketched it in very quickly, this feeling of looking at Monsieur Lautrec at work. And it had all the freshness and delight that his mind must have had as he looked up and saw Lautrec, wearing yellow trousers and a red shirt. I purchased all the stock of these postcards and sent them to friends. And I must admit that most of the friends told me later that the morning they got the postcard and looked at it, how thrilling it was, even a postcard, the very object they were holding. Well, it's true this, you can get the magic to come even off reproductions. Now people will say it's not the same thing. Of course, the picture is the thing, that's where you get the real pleasure. The picture has to exist, otherwise the postcard cannot exist. The postcard can exist because a method of making pictures was invented in the 19th century that people mistook for something else, and it is called photography. Now, I think the best use for photography, the best use for it, is photographing other pictures. It is the only time it can be true to its medium, in the sense that it's real. This is the only way that you can take a picture that could be described as having a strong illusion of reality, because on the flat surface of the photograph is simply reproduced another flat surface, a painting. In any other photograph, it's not reproducing a flat surface. So I suddenly realized this when I went off photography. Sometimes I go hot and cold. I think it's an interesting way to make pictures. And then I think, no, it's got unbelievably severe limitations that make it a minor technique, really. So, at the moment I'm off, and I suddenly realize the best thing it can do, and its true thing, is this. Now, that means a great number of people who never came to the National Gallery can have rather good reproductions of the paintings. The reproduction, for instance, of the Piero della Francesca that I had on my wall, we have here on the screen. Of course, in this room where you can see the real thing, the original, and you see the cheap photographic copy, and you can compare the two, of course you are not going to take much notice of the cheap photographic reproduction. Why should you? But you can take the cheap photographic copy home. You can pin it up next to your bed. You can have a look at it at night. You can wake up and have a look at it in the morning. And it's giving off pleasure in strange ways that go on and on. Sometimes, the more you look at it, you notice different things. Piero, it struck me the other day when I was looking at it, the reproduction that is, here in New York, in the wall. I suddenly thought one of the marvelous things about this picture, how beautiful it is, there are so many things about it, is that there are hints. For instance, the bird that is hovering over the head of Christ seems not to be moving. Now you say, well, nothing is moving in the still picture. But there are marvelous suggestions of movement elsewhere in the picture. Just below, the water being poured doesn't seem still. It's an action that's going on. You feel it going on. Therefore, contrasting the bird with these things make it hover, as though it's still. All this seems to me as just some of the things artists do to have an effect. It's the skill of making the picture, part of the skill of making the picture. You might say these are all easy tricks. Well, it's true. There are many things people who construct pictures and make them employ to create a certain effect, to make something dramatic. These effects people used to study, rather academically. They were treated as parts of things that were useful for the artist in depicting his experience in the visible world, of the things outside him that are part of him. As you pick up a reproduction, or as you pick up this piece of paper you are reading from, you look at a surface. Some suggestions in modern art have been that everything you see is on the surface. And therefore, to be true to it, you could eliminate certain things, to be even more truer, just as I am suggesting that the photograph, to be true to itself, should only photograph other flat surface, because that's what it can do. Yet surfaces can be broken in many ways. The surface of this paper, as you are looking at it, has got type on it that you are now reading, and the type forms patterns that have meaning, and thus you get the ideas, or at the least the words I am saying come into your head. Now that is caused, people will say, by these patterns simply being on the surface, and there's nothing more. But what there is more of them is the meaning of the words and ideas that have come into your head. Well, in the same way, you can break surfaces. If you go back to George Herbert's line, a man that looks on glass, on it may stay his eye, or, if he please, through it pass and then they have an spy. A simple idea of how you can choose where to look. As a metaphor, it opens up incredible ways of looking, or suggestion, and it uses the surface idea that there is something the surface can stop, or that you can go through it. Even with a sheet of glass, your imagination comes to work more, perhaps, when you have gone through the glass, because the glass disappears. You have made that surface disappear. A painting, of course, always has a surface. It cannot disappear. But in your imagination it can, and that is part of the magic of pictures. There's a painting in the National Gallery in Scotland by Ruburn of a man skating. It's called The Reverend Robert Walker Skating on Daddingstone Loch. A beautiful picture. It could be subtitled Confidence. It's got great elegance in the balance of the picture. It's very harmonious and pleasing. There is something right about it, deeply. And in the painting, he's skating on ice, and Ruburn has depicted on the painting cracks in the ice and the marks where the skates have gone around. Then, a few years later, cracks appear in the painting of the cracks, and then the painting was photographed. The photograph took a painting of another flat surface, including the cracks that had occurred in the painting. Then they made a reproduction of it, and I purchased one in Edinburgh, and they said, "We will send it to you in California." They put it in a tube, and it got a bit scratched along the way. So, when it finally got to me, the paper surface had been cracked. And at first I thought, ruined. Then I pinned it up on the wall, and one evening I was looking at it, and you are forced to always come back to the surface of even what you are looking at, the piece of paper. And I suddenly saw all the levels of cracking, and it amused me actually. It delighted me, and I thought, no, it's not been ruined. There's something else that's been added. So there we had the painted, depicted cracks on the ice. We then had the cracks in the painting that had been made flat on the new surface of the paper. And then we had the cracks in the paper on top of the other cracks. Different focusing. It's different focusing of the eye, moving in, getting in. So then I'm looking at this and I thought, some lines come to me suddenly. I remember the lines of T.S. Eliot evoking this marvelously. A painter of the Umbrian school designed upon a gesso ground the nimbus of the baptized God. The wilderness is cracked and browned. It's the sudden change of the focus back to the surface. What it does mean, it seems to me, is that not everything you see on the surface is all there. It seems perfectly clear to me. The amusing side of this was then made by Magritte, who once made a picture of a pipe and it says underneath, "This is not a pipe." A perfectly true statement, it is a picture of a pipe. And, of course, there's a vast difference. You cannot smoke the picture of a pipe like a pipe. It has different qualities. He's simply pointing them out and thinking that perhaps it needed pointing out. Well, it does at times. Again, it's bringing us back to the surface. So I'm going on and on about the surface because when you are looking at the real painting, the surface of the painting is also a delight. There are times when you can look at these pictures, and although nothing might happen for a while, you might think, is it possible to look at these pictures for half an hour? But the longer you look, the richer they get. And of course, it makes it difficult to look at them for half an hour if there's just these 4 pictures. You have to come to the National Gallery, and if you do, of course, pleasure is deepest, because you're looking at the original thing that the artist did, that whatever the other reproductions have could not have been made without the original painting. For in the real one, you can see more. But the moment you begin to break the surface of the painting, what you begin to get is also what you can begin to get from the reproduction. The delight in the use of shapes, of its colors, of its relation to the subject matter, how they relate, how important it all is, when you can go back to the still bird over Christ. How you realize it's still. How does he make it still? What am I saying? It's still. Of course it's still. Nothing moves in the picture. Nothing moves in an ordinary way. Yet you can believe this. And, of course, if photography gets better, eventually we will have almost replicas of the painting that you can have in your house. They will be almost like the real thing, and everybody will suggest that the machinery to do this is a wonderful invention. It's true, it will be. But without the original paintings, what would it do? what would this machinery do? It can only reproduce, but to reproduce means there must be something to begin with. So we must have this idea of making pictures that can tell us more than photographs can tell us. When I bought one of those stereotape machines that play on your head, somebody said, "Oh, you just like gadgets, David." I said, "Well, it's not a real gadget. It's to bring music into your life. It helps music, this little machine, if you want music to tell you something and make it all more interesting." That's the purpose of this gadget, and it seems to me a noble purpose. There's a lot of music you can listen to. You can listen on the bus, you can listen in the National Gallery. Nobody hears it. So you could have a lot more time to listen to music if that is what you want to do. So all the ideas that went into the machinery have improved where and how you listen to music. Of course, they don't improve the music. That's another kind of thing. Technological advance is quite different from artistic advance, which I think there's really no such thing. So I have suggested to the National Gallery that it would be interesting, for example, to see the reproductions as well, assuming at the moment that I think these reproductions are not obviously true. It's not a replica of the painting, it's not the same size, but it can still give you, or me anyway, immense pleasure. So it does do something, this piece of paper that Piero della Francesca decorated. And even if you say it misses out too much, I'm not sure it always does. I think the pleasure is still great enough to welcome the idea. When I put the reproductions up on my wall one time, somebody said, "Oh, this is a terrible thing to do because reproductions are terrible, and what was best was an artist's original work, an original print, where an artist thought about the print medium to conceive a work in the true spirit of the medium. The reproduction does not do this. This is true, but the reproduction uses the skills of the craftsmen who devised these machines to do it, and they are skillful. They were made by skillful and inventive people, but craftsmen, not necessarily artists. What they were doing was something different." The connection between the ideas that can be communicated in painting, the experiences that can be shared by paintings, things painting can do that other arts cannot do, is what we delight in. The strangest images that are made now are at sporting events that we see, usually in a newspaper or book. They show you pictures that are extremely unrealistic, in the sense that you never saw anything like that if you were at the sporting event. You have never seen anybody suspended in air. You have never seen the ball stood still, and in photographs they seem still, because it's got very little time in it. The sports photograph is a fraction of a second, and that's what you see. But that is not what you felt. You felt the time moving on in the sporting event. The photograph has great difficulty in depicting time, and if we go back to the Piero I suggested in this painting, this bird was still, but another part was not. Well, of course, painting, imaginative painting, can do this, and in this sense it is much closer to true experience. It tells of the experience more vividly. About 60 years ago, most educated people could draw in quite a skillful way, which meant they could tell other people about certain experiences in a certain way. Their visual delights could be expressed. And today, people don't draw very much. They use the camera. My point is, they are not truly perhaps expressing what it was they were looking at, what it was about it that delighted them, and how that delight forced them to make something of it, to shape the experience, to make it vivid to somebody else. If the few skills that are needed in drawing are not treated seriously by everybody, eventually it will die, and then all that will be left is the photographic ideal, which we believe too highly of. So here's my short plea for an art of depiction to be kept up. And that means, when I say keeping it up, I mean, there are certain things in an art of depiction that can be taught to anybody, and especially, one could think, any educated person. Because slowly what would happen, of course, is that primitive art would develop again and the skills slowly would return. It's true. This would take time though, because it would take a long time before people began to realize that an area of experience was being lost, and would be lost because people would not have the ability to share it with someone else, which is one of the great delights of art. That it is indeed a sharing experience, which is why, in some way, that art is our salvation.